From creepy hotels where the guest never left to forgotten asylums with broken pasts. Come join us as we explore some of the darker stories surrounding the United States. Put on your nightlight because we are about to dive into the creepy side of America.
Welcome to the Creepy Side of America. I am Dan Kozlowski. The Creepy Side of America is a new podcast series we're doing here at WNEP. And different from the Creepy Side of NEPA, we are actually going to bring some other co-workers here at WNEP onto the show to sort of co-host different episodes. In this episode, we have Emily Gertzman. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you join me for the first episode of the Creepy Side of America.
We have a good one in store, too, I think.
Who do we have tonight?
So we talked with Mac Bauman from NYC Gangsters and Ghosts for this very first inaugural episode of Creepy Side of America.
And it definitely was an interesting interview, especially that combination of gangsters and then also ghost stories. What a perfect tour.
It was. You think you'd go to New York City to go see a Broadway show, and Mac kind of showed you can go on a ghost tour while you go there, too.
Let's get right into the interview. Mac, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us. So if you wouldn't mind just getting started and telling us about what you do with the Gangsters and Ghost Tour.
Yeah, because when we were doing a little bit of research, it definitely sounds like a very interesting tour. You don't really hear many gangster tours around.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely a good time. I enjoy myself very much. So it's technically like a two-part tour. First part is gangster. We start in the old neighborhood of the Five Points neighborhood, kind of where the first gangs formed in New York City. Then we head more into proper Chinatown, talk about the Tongs, these very wealthy institutions in Chinatown and how they kind of bankrolled different gangs from the early 1900s all the way through the mid 1990s. And then we spend a good portion of the gangster tour on the mafia in Little Italy. And we dive pretty deep into them, though, the mafia itself, you could spend, a whole week just talking about them.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of stories in New York about them.
Oh, yeah. And people, we're kind of, I don't know, I feel like New York would not be the same without the mafia.
It's part of the history, yeah.
It is. They really formed it, yeah. And so then from there, we make a little quick trip over to Washington Square Park, where we get a bit spookier, and we start the ghost tour there. We talk about some suicides in the area. We talk about some fires, a mass grave, and then we usually end with the House of Death. It's over on 10th Street.
Oh, boy. And so this is all a walking tour. You're mentioning all these different locations. Everyone just kind of walks around.
Yeah, all the walking tour. It is a good amount of walking, but it's very New York to be walking everywhere.
Yep.
Now, are all the ghost stories mob related?
No, so it technically is like two-part tour. Though there is a little overlap in the Washington Square Park, in the arch itself, actually.
Kind of where the two parts of the tour meet, so kind of fitting where that would be the overlapping point.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you want to hear some ghost stories?
Sure.
That's why you're here, right? Of course we want to hear them.
I'm like, shall we get into it?
Of course.
Let's hear some of your favorites.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with, currently Washington Square Park is pretty surrounded by NYU. It's kind of all NYU territory now, but before it was NYU, it was the Garment District, kind of starting in the mid 1800s. Though now the Garment District has moved up into like the 30s streets of Manhattan. Come 1880, this garment called the shirtwaist becomes really popular. There's a lot of money to be had in it, in that it is worn by women, and women are kind of entering the workforce in the United States for the first time during that time. And so these different shirtwaist factories start popping up, and people start making a ton of money. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory pops up in, what's the building? 23 Washington Place. It is now the Brown Building, which is owned by NYU, but a bit ironically named, as we will soon discover. It used to be called the Ash Building. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory pops up in the top 3 floors. The top floor, the 10th floor, was the executive and administrative floor, and then the actual factory itself was the 9th and the 8th floor. Now, this factory made a lot of money because they cut a lot of corners. Most of their workers were young Jewish and Italian immigrants that they were paying close to nothing. There were constant walkouts, constant strikes. They would break fire codes all the time, and they would pay a little fine, but never actually change anything. And this really, really comes to a head March 25th, 1911, when on the 8th floor, a fire breaks out.
Uh-oh.
Now, have you ever made your own fire?
In a fire
like
pit in my
a campfire.
backyard. Yeah, that's about as far as we go, yeah.
So you need your wood, right? As well as some like extra tinder to kind of get it
a little
going,
kindling
right?
and things like that, yep.
Yeah. Now this is a garment factory. There's loose scraps of cloth everywhere.
Oh, gosh.
So it's basically, right?
It sounds disastrous to me.
Yes.
It was a house of cards, really just
I was
going to
say
collapse.
it probably went up quick, I would imagine.
It quickly spreads, unfortunately. And now the real kicker is that one of the poor ways they would treat the workers is that they would lock them in the factory.
So they were trapped.
Yeah, they were
gosh.
trapped. According to the owners, they wanted to cut down on unofficial breaks and potential theft. I don't know. I really just think they were trying to work them as much as they could,
Yeah, that sounds terrible to me, and lock that work.
Awful, right? So they scramble about. They eventually get a door open, apparently. But like I said, they were breaking a lot of fire codes. And so this door, instead of being a push-out door, was a pull-in door. And so a few escape. But then in the chaos, they essentially lock it again as they're trying to push out this pull-in door. The fire department shows up. Their ladders go to the 4th floor, though, and so that's not really any help. They get up their hoses, but with the water pressure of the early 1900s, it really only hits the outside of the 8th floor. It doesn't really get into the 8th floor to do any damage on the fire. And then lastly, they have these large safety trampolines, but those are only to be used of a height of about 60 feet. Now, this building, especially the 8th floor itself, is a lot higher than 60 feet. And so instead of getting caught, the victims actually end up crashing through the safety trampolines. It's pretty rough.
It sounds like they weren't prepared for a building that big at that time.
No.
I don't think they were. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the safety precautions. They didn't have the regulations to make sure people were keeping up with fire codes like they do now. Unfortunately, that is not the case anymore. We are
And
a
I'm
lot
sure the
safer
fire
now.
codes are a lot different now than it was back then.
Especially in New York, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially like buildings used to be, all wood, and they would go down in a second. Actually, there's an interesting thing about the gangster tours is a lot of fire houses started off as gangs because they didn't have like state-funded firehouses, and so there would be these different fire gangs that would pop up and fight the fires. But going back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, 146 people died that day. It's still known as one of the largest industrial catastrophes in the United States.
Wow.
And kind of going back to those fire codes, there's a bit of a silver lining in that 300,000 people take to the streets in protest. A lot of labor laws were passed. A lot of child labor laws were passed because the youngest victim that day was only 14 years old. And then a lot of fire codes are revised and supervision is kind of heightened. And so if you look at the treatment of factory workers in the United States, it's kind of like pre-triangle, post-triangle. Now, the topic at hand.
The
Where are
ghosts.
The creepier side of things.
Yeah. So I actually went to NYU many, many moons ago And if you walk around those hallways on the 8th floor, it's a bit of a cliche, but you are met with lights that are never fully working. There's always a row that is out, and then NYU will go in and fix it. That's obviously, a big liability for a student hallway to be, not fully lit.
Of course.
Right? And it's like it's a bad case of waiting to happen. So they'll go in and fix them, and then they'll break again. And then they'll fix them again, and then they'll break again. And they just can't seem to fix these lights for any sort of extended period. It's a bit strange. Then in 2017, Bustle does this series of a woman psychic going around to different death sites where girls and women had died to try to get advice for the modern day woman. And she goes to the 8th floor. She goes to one of the classrooms and reaches out, and these spirits come forward. And they say that they are 17-year-old sisters. She then, begins to do a bit of her own investigation. It's like, all right, spirits, let me suss it out a little bit. And she goes to the death manifest, and she comes across 17-year-old Brenneman sisters that had died in the fire. She then does even more digging and finds that the brother was also in the fire, and reaches out to his grandson. Of course, the story had been passed down through the ages and all that. Mm-hmm. She then, goes back in there and ends up turning the conversation around a bit into this lighter note, ending it on a good note in that she says, what happened here, you did not die in vain. Because of what happened here, we now have these, fair rights.
You said all those labor laws and different things got passed and people really spoke out after that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And fire codes and whatnot.
Sure.
Yeah, it turned that corner, which should have been turned many, many years before that. But, it was kind of this, almost like this involuntary sacrifice, right? This moment of service. And it's a really lovely ending to, I think, a tragic story, really.
Yeah, and you said so this building is on NYU where you said you had went once upon a time. So now is this a public building that anyone could go into, or is it strictly like only if you're NYU you go in this building?
It's only NYU
Got
students. Yeah. I've actually been giving some of these tours before, and there'll be, an NYU student every once in a while on it, and they're like, oh, yes, you've experienced the lights, right? And I'm like, yes, of
like
course.
You're part of a club.
So people are still experiencing things to this day.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's wild. And it's so, you see in movies and you're like, oh, the lights are flickering. Ha 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 ha. And then you actually get in that hallway and you're like, oh, this isn't funny.
Yeah, it's different when it actually happens to you.
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, this feels like something else. Yeah. So that's the old location of the Ash building. It's the original facade of the building. But of course, the interior's been done over the ages.
I now understand why it's called the Ash Building.
Yeah.
Or was called the Ash Building.
Right.
What are some other kind of main points of attraction on the tour?
So Washington Square Park itself, that area from the early colony of New York kind of to the early 1800s, there was this big farming field where the park is now. It acted as a buffer between the early colony and the Lenape tribe that still held territory north of there. Though come the Revolutionary War in 1776, a lot of people are dying. The Revolutionary War at that time was the bloodiest war in the world. And so they need a place to put these bodies. And they look on the outskirts of this colony and they're like, well, we think that farming field is a good place to put these bodies. And so they turn the farming field into a mass grave.
I was going to say, I feel like this is the mass grave you mentioned earlier.
Yep. Now,
and how many bodies are we talking that they put in this grave?
I don't think we're just talking one or two here.
No.
just a little bit.
just a couple.
No. It's so it opened, during the Revolutionary War. It has all of those bodies in there. But then after the war ends, yellow fever and cholera break out in the city. They go away and they come back a few times. Eventually, the graveyard closes in 1824. Now, between all of those deaths, there are around 20,000 bodies underneath Washington Square Park.
Definitely more than one or two.
I wasn't expecting that many.
No.
Right. It's a pretty wild fact. And having gone to NYU, I've spent a lot of time in Washington Square Park and never knew that.
I was going to say, now knowing that, it's got to be a weird feeling when you go to that area.
It's so strange because it's a pretty happy park. Like, it's a pretty vibrant park. And you just knowing that fact and actually
majority
kind of
of the people probably have no idea.
Yeah, no idea. People have no idea.
I was going to say, I have friends who live in New York City, and I'm familiar with New York City, and I don't feel like I'm ever going to go to that park and feel the same again.
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling.
Yeah.
But especially, they're only like 10 feet below the ground. It's not like there's been like a lot of layering on top of this mass grave. And so they're pretty close to the surface. To
your knowledge, do you know if any popped up over the years?
So they've done a fairly good job at making sure they don't pop up.
For it being a happy park, I think that'd be a priority.
Right. Because after it was closed, actually, it was turned into military parade and practice grounds for a little bit. And while it was those parade grounds, they would have a lot of occurrences of these bodies kind of coming to the surface. And then they decided to exhume just the top layer of the bodies. And they put those over on Ward's Island. And so...
Do you know when that exhumation happened at all by chance? Just curious.
I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but the parade grounds was, military parade grounds was functioning from 1824 to 1849.
So 1800s still probably,
in between that range, yeah. And then it turns into the park that we see today, starting in 1849. And so the ghost hunting community of New York loves that area. They say because of all of those bodies, there's just so much residual energy. People have reported seeing, these weird just phantoms lurking. There's, so many winding pathways in Washington Square Park. And, they'll catch like a vision of somebody under a lamp and then look away and then they'll be gone. Taking a picture of the area is the best way to see something, paranormal in that area. They'll see a glowing orb or a green shimmer of something inside the picture. Yeah,
sure. And I have a question for you. So how long have you been doing these tours? Have you been with the tours from the beginning, or when did the tour start and when did you come aboard?
Yeah, so I've actually been with the tours about a year and a half.
Got it.
Funny enough, I started doing them fall 2020 during lockdown.
Oh gosh.
Virtual tours, actually. So I would give the same exact tour, except people would stream in with this app, and I would have like an Android and a fancy selfie stick, like a gimbal, and they would stream in and I'd do the tour.
And so you would go walk around by yourself and do the tour, and they would just follow virtually.
Yeah, so you would be the only one out there actually going on the tour.
Yeah, and so it was all social distance safe and all that.
That's interesting. I never heard of a ghost tour doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was honestly a really good time, and so I just stuck with it afterwards. I get to meet some cool people that I normally would never meet, right? And
I'm sure this community that surrounds kind of the gangsters and ghosts, as you were kind of mentioning, the paranormal community is probably filled with some characters, so...
Exactly. That's what I was... Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, it's a very particular type of person that picks a gangster and ghost tour, and most people that go on the tour are quite passionate about either one of the subjects or both of them.
Right.
And so it's I have a lot of enjoyment seeing their enjoyment of like, oh, that's where this is. Oh, I've read about that. Oh my gosh, this is that place.
Making that connection, yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a good connection between the two of them. The two subjects sort of go hand in hand, I would think.
Oh, they do. They go so well, especially, I think maybe the Gangsters have caused a lot of, untimely deaths in their reign. And so there's, I'm sure, plenty of, gangster ghosts walking around Little Italy.
Sure. And have you ever had any particular encounters, like while you've been out on a tour? Like obviously, you talked about, people taking a photo and they see a lit up orb or different kind of things like that. Or have there been any kind of those moments that you've personally experienced when you're out on a tour?
So at the very last stop we give of the House of Death, yes, I've seen, it's like this big townhouse. It's like 5 floors, and I'll give the tour night quite often. And every once in a while, you can see pretty well into some of the units, and there's just like, you'll catch a glimpse of somebody in the window, but it doesn't look like somebody. It's a figure. And then you
kind of like a shadow?
Come again?
Kind of like a shadow?
Yeah, like this shadowy thing.
Makes you look twice.
It makes you look twice. And you're like, oh, maybe that was just a reflection. But I've seen it just too many times now for it to just be some sort of reflection or like my bad eyesight.
Sure. And you mentioned this is at the House of Death. So where exactly is that? And I'm curious as to why it's called the House of Death. I feel as though I have to ask that question.
Oh, you must. It's my favorite stop on the tour. It's the very last stop. I save it, best for last. So the House of Death is 14 West 10th Street. And many, many stories about this place. The first one actually comes from Mark Twain himself. He owned the building in the year 1900.
Oh, this is dating back quite a little ways then.
Oh, yeah. Pretty well back. Long history there. The story we get from one of his journals that was published post-mortem is just kind of this, random entry that is pretty easily overlooked, but the story goes is that he's at his dining room table alone, eating some food. He looks into his fireplace to his right, and he sees a log, and it's on fire. That all checks out. But then it begins to float. He freaks out, obviously, as I think anybody would. He also has a pistol on his table, and so he grabs the pistol. He shoots the log. The log falls down, goes out, and a pool of blood spills from the log.
Oh boy.
Wow.
Now, Mark Twain was a pretty pragmatic man. He was kind of scientific. And so he brushes it off. He's like, you know what? It wasn't actually floating. I was drinking a little too much. A rat grabbed it from the fireplace, and
trying to find some reason.
Yeah, just like really reaching for some reason, right? Like, sure, the rat jumped into the fireplace, right? And then at the very end of his entry, he notes that if he was going to believe in the floating log, he would then have to believe in so much more. And he decidedly said, no, thank you.
It was going to open a Pandora's box, and he said, keep it closed.
Yeah, that sounds like a wild story to start off with.
So, we've got more for you.
The House of Death is not done.
The House of Death is far from done. So, next story is 1933. We get this from an old police report. By now, Mark Twain is long gone. A new family has moved in. One night, the daughter goes up to the mother of the household, terrified. She's seen a man in the house. They run around. They try to find the intruder. The authorities come, but they can't find anybody. So, assuming that the daughter has made up this story, they go to her and they're like, you can't do this. Like, we love your playing with your imagination, but this was just a little, too far. But then the daughter insists, no, I saw a man. He even said something. Oh, okay. What did he say? playing along, still thinking that she's made this up.
Right.
Imaginary friend, right?
Right, exactly. Like, kids, they think of all sorts of things, but they also see things, I think, that other people don't.
Mm-hmm.
So they ask, what did he say? The daughter says that the man said, I am Clemens, and I has business to do.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's not creepy at all.
Right.
He's got
Right.
business.
His business to do. Now, Samuel Clemens being Mark Twain's real name. Now, when I was a child, I did not know that. Maybe this child was a bit precocious, right? Like we talked about, a good imagination. But doing a little more digging, when Mark Twain owned the building, he was in a lot of financial hardship. And so it's tossed around that these, hardships were tying him to the building those many years later. And so he was a bit stuck there.
Yeah, that's kind of similar to another interview that we had. They kind of said there were a lot of, in that case, there were a lot of suicides and things like that in the house. And so that would kind of keep those spirits there. Like they had a connection and a reason to stay.
Yeah, especially if they have some kind of unfinished business. And it sounds like
Business
maybe
to
Mark
do.
Twain might have had some unfinished business.
Right. It's gonna tie you there. Like there's always some reasoning, right? Now, still not done with this place. This place.
And before you go any farther about the
Oh,
house,
sure, yeah.
is it like a single family home or is it like an apartment building? How is the house like figured?
Yeah, when those first two stories, it was a single family home.
Okay.
It is a 5-story home, but come by 1957, it's split up into different apartment units.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is the same way now.
I hate to ask you, do people live in the house of death right now? If it's apartments, I feel like they have to be very brave people, but
Or not know.
or not know. Yeah.
I don't know. I'll be giving these, and people will be coming in and out.
Oh wow.
And I need one day I will stop them and try to get a firsthand experience.
Yeah, it's like, do you know where you live? Do you just not care?
I guess they just don't care. Maybe rent is a little cheaper.
Yeah, maybe they get a discount. But if I walked out and saw a tour in front of my house at night, I would have some questions.
You'd be like, what's going on? Though honestly, knowing New York, they'd probably be like, oh, you have some extra company. You're never, you got some friends all the time. You're paying extra. They would try to swing it some way. All right, so next story about this place. You ready?
Yep.
1957.
So we're like about
Bryant
25 years after this now, right? Because you said we were in the 1930s before.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So 25 years later, about Jan Bryant Bartell moves into the very top unit with her husband. She talks about at that time there was a housing crisis in New York. That there's really just low vacancy. There weren't a lot of apartments around, and so she found this place and she didn't really like it. Upon entering into the unit, she immediately got some not great vibes, but wasn't a lot of options, and so she was like, okay, sure, fine. Bartell herself was a bit of a Broadway actress, also a novelist, and then as she's living at 14 West 10th Street, she starts to pick up on some things, coming into some, psychic abilities a bit. She, as describes, first picks up on this mist inside of the house. She sees the mist in her own unit. The mist then appears in the common stairwell, and then she sees it in another unit in the same building while visiting a friend downstairs. Then at night, she starts to pick up on these shadows on the wall that kind of begin to shift into these creature-like shapes, but nothing she'd ever seen before. And then lastly, she begins to pick up on what she describes as a substance without substance. That in the same room, in the corner, there's something, but also this nothingness, this void.
That's an interesting description.
Yeah, I can't. It's hard to picture. That's for sure.
Substance without substance.
Substance without substance. Ugh. She describes that it, quote, chills her to the marrow, right? Like the bone marrow to the core. Feeling a bit out of sorts, a bit, new to her psychic abilities, she decides to reach out. Feeling a bit, scared coming into these psychic abilities and experiencing these paranormal things for the first time. She reaches out for help to this man named Hans Holzer. Now, he was one of the writers of the Amityville book. You've probably heard of the, Amityville horror before.
Certainly has.
That's in Pennsylvania, is it not? The Amityville house?
I believe New York.
Amityville's New
Long
York?
Island.
Which one am I thinking of?
Smurl Haunting was in Pennsylvania.
Oh,
yep.
yep.
That was in West Pittston.
Yup, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so...
he was one of the authors of Amityville. Go ahead, sorry.
So he wrote that and was kind of a lead, paranormal investigator as well. And so Bartell reaches out to him. He goes to 14 West 10th Street and does his work. He does his investigation and eventually concludes that there are 22 spirits attached to, the stairwells, the chandeliers, the curtains, everywhere inside of that house. He also concludes that these spirits are not particularly happy with Bartell, in that she is collecting her findings and going to write a book, right? She's a novelist inside of a haunted house. She sees how well the Amityville book did. She sees an opportunity.
Sure.
Right? Can't blame her.
No, I would do the same, actually.
Yeah. But these spirits are not happy that she's, putting so much attention into them. So Holzer advises that she leaves, that she moves out. She says yes, but not yet. There's more work to be done. Eventually, after Hans Holzer's advice, she moves out a year later. But within that year, in that building, 9 people die.
Oh boy.
Wow, right after he told her to move out?
Yeah, over that year.
From what kind of causes did they die? Natural or unnatural?
Yeah, there's some natural causes. There's a couple of heart attacks. There's a couple of suicides, and there's even a murder inside of them.
All in the same year in one building.
All in a year.
Wow.
I don't know why it takes her 9 deaths to finally move out.
Right?
Yeah,
like
we'll be out
1,
of there
2
before
wouldn't
then.
be enough. No, 9's the last straw.
Like, no matter how good the story is, I'm like, why move out? Or, sorry.
Yeah,
no
why
matter how
stay?
good this... Yeah, why stay? Like, come on. So she moves out and begins to work on her final manuscript. She gets a publishing deal. She sends it off to the publisher. It's out for about a month. And then she kills herself.
Ooh.
Like, what?
So,
Yeah.
did the book ever get out? If she got it to the publisher and then she passed away, did the book still ever get out then?
Yeah, so it went to print. It's called Spindrift, a spray from a psychic sea. I actually got gifted it for Christmas. I have it in my hand right now, actually. But I'm kind of... I started reading it and then I stopped because I feel like I know too much already. and so I don't know. When I'm feeling brave, I'll pick it up like every once in a while, but it's pretty wild.
Wow. What a Christmas present, too. Did someone give that to you after you started the tours?
Yeah, they're like, oh, you did this tour, let me find the book. I'm like, oh, thanks. I don't know if I want to read it.
Yeah, it seems like a little bit of uncertainty around that whole story and book there.
Yeah. But yeah, there's actually one more story about this place.
Sure.
You ready?
Yeah.
So, what is it? 1987.
We're getting into more recent times here.
Oh yeah, we're getting a little close to home. 1987 had Nussbaum and Joel Steinberg have moved into a unit. One night in November, 911 dispatch picks up a call from Hedda. She's in hysterics. Her daughter is unconscious. They have a daughter from Joel's previous marriage and a son adopted as well. So the ambulance dispatch the police and ambulance. Upon arriving in their unit, they find over $25,000 in loose cash just strewn about the apartment. They find a bunch of marijuana. They find over a dozen crack pipes. They find their son, tied to a chair, drinking spoiled milk in a puddle of his own urine.
Ugh.
They find Hedda pretty beaten up. And then lastly, they find their little girl, Lisa, unconscious, covered in her own blood. Apparently, they had been up for 3 days on a bender. Joel had snapped and then took most of it out on Hedda and then the little girl, Lisa.
Wow.
She doesn't survive that night, Lisa. Both of them are arrested, but then Hedda testifies against Joel, so she's acquitted, and Joel goes away for several years. Yeah, so a pretty gruesome scene there. And, if this was a couple of doors down or a couple of blocks down, I wouldn't really think too much
But
of
it's
it.
the same,
same house.
house.
Yep.
But it's the same house that all of this has happened.
And I definitely
Right.
understand why it has the name the House of Death now.
Yeah, right? I'm thinking that the spirits didn't maybe take Joel's, vulnerable, intoxicated state and do a bit of their ill will, right?
Yeah.
Definitely sounds like a very good possibility.
Yeah.
And sounds like a very, I don't want to say a good place, but for the sake of the tour, a very good place to end. I know you said you saved the best for last, and that's, wow. I still can't believe all that happened in one house. I mean, the 9 deaths in the 1 year is enough, never mind on top of everything else.
Yeah, it's a juicy house.
And I'm sure there's a lot of stories
stories.
that we don't even know anything about.
Yeah, and that's the thing is I've tried to track down any sort of ideas on what was there before the house, but I haven't found anything yet, unfortunately. Because something why did all of this begin?
Yeah, there must be a cause somewhere down the road.
Yeah.
Like we said earlier, kind of looking for the reason.
Yeah. Where's that reason?
Yeah.
But the case is afoot.
Okay, well, I don't want you to give up too much of the Ghost Walk. That was definitely some very interesting stories, that's for sure, especially that last one, the House of Death.
Yeah. I love that one. I think it's a pretty solid story.
It's definitely the favorite one I had that you shared with us this evening.
Agreed. Yeah.
Oh, good.
And so
Good.
how long does all this take? So obviously it's a 2-part tour. It all happens in the same period of time, right? So how long does everything take to go through?
Yeah, so it's the whole thing's 2 hours.
Seems like
It's
a lot of
about-
information to squeeze
Yeah.
into 2 hours.
Seems like a very
It is
entertaining
lot.
2 hours.
I talk very fast. I try to get as much in without being too overwhelming with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we do, a tour every day, 11, 3, and 8. The website's a great place to book them.
And what is your website if anyone's interested in going on the tour in New York City?
The website is NYC gangstersandghosts.com.
Okay, and
So
that is
you-
the best place to get information on the tours?
Yep, that is the best place. You can book through there. And you can also, there's a phone number there too if anybody has some further questions.
And so you said there's tours 3 times a day. Are you the only tour guide? If anyone listens to this podcast and is so inclined to come on a tour, they're going to get you, or is there anybody else who gives the tours?
Oh, we have a great team of tour guides.
Cool.
We're all really awesome. A lot of us are friends actually. And so it's a good group. We shadow each other sometimes. And so, any tour guide you get is going to be a fun time.
Great.
Well, Mac, I'd like to thank you again for joining us this evening. It was very interesting talking to you about these stories of gangsters and ghosts in New York City.
I might have to come. I'm a little hooked and intrigued, so.
Oh, you must. Come on over. Come take the tour.
We're not that far, so I might just do that.
Yeah, no, weather is nice in the city now, and it's a lovely time to just be walking around and learning about some crazy New York stories.
Definitely sounds like there's quite a few of them, that's for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed coming on and talking to you.
We enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for joining us in this episode of The Creepy Side of America. And Emily, thanks for joining us and co-hosting this very first episode.
Thanks for having me. I hope I'll be back again for another one. It was a lot of fun.
I'm sure you'll be back for a few more.
Maybe a few.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening. And if you have a story or maybe even an idea for an upcoming episode, give us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is ghost@wnep.com. And until next time, enjoy the creepy side of America.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Creepy Side of America. If you have any ideas or topic suggestions for an upcoming episode, send them to ghost@wnep.com. We're dying to hear from you.